When my father died, my brother walked away with the restaurant, the savings account, and 40 years of my father's name. I got a greenhouse. A broken, overgrown greenhouse at the edge of a county road that nobody drove down anymore. My husband didn't even wait until we got home to laugh. Make sure you hit like and subscribe before we go any further. This story took everything from me before it gave me something better. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed that working hard and staying quiet was enough. I believed that if you loved someone the right way, they would eventually see you. I was wrong about both of those things, and my father knew it before I did. He passed away on a Tuesday in March. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though my father had been slowing down for 2 years before that. The kind of slow that you notice but don't say out loud because saying it out loud makes it real. I visited every Sunday. My brother visited on holidays. My husband came twice. The will reading was scheduled for the Saturday after the funeral. My attorney, a quiet woman named Mrs. Aldridge who had known my father for 30 years, read from a single typed document in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. My brother sat across from me. His wife sat next to him with her hands folded in her lap like she was already planning where to put the furniture. My husband sat beside me and checked his phone twice in the first 5 minutes. Mrs. Aldridge read my brother's portion first. The restaurant on Clement Avenue. The 2 investment accounts totaling just over $300,000. The truck. The tools in the garage. My brother exhaled slowly, the way people do when they've confirmed something they already suspected. His wife touched his arm. Then Mrs. Aldridge looked at me. The Green Road property, she said, including the greenhouse structure and the land parcel totaling 11 acres, will go to Claire. My brother nodded once, the way you nod when something confirms your theory. My husband went completely still beside me. Mrs. Aldridge continued with a few smaller items, a piece of jewelry, some books, a donation to a local shelter. But the room had already moved on. My brother's wife was whispering something to him. My husband was staring at the table. On the drive home, he said nothing until we were on the highway. Then he said, 11 acres of weeds. I looked out the window. Your father ran a restaurant for 40 years and you got a greenhouse that hasn't been used since your mother died. He paused. That's actually incredible. He didn't mean it as a compliment. That night, my brother called to check in. His voice was warm in the way it gets when he feels like he won something. He told me if I ever wanted to sell the land, he knew a guy who handled agricultural properties. Probably won't fetch much, he said, but something is better than nothing. I told him I'd think about it. After we hung up, my husband came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. You know the restaurant alone does $200,000 a year, he said. I know. Your father had $300,000 in accounts and he left all of it to your brother. I didn't answer. He shook his head. An embarrassment, he said. That's what that is. A grown man leaves his daughter an embarrassment. He walked out. I stood at the sink and turned the water on and off 3 times just to have something to do with my hands. That was a Thursday. By Sunday, I had decided I needed to see the property. Not because I expected anything. Honestly, I think I went because it was the last place my father had touched, and I needed to be somewhere that still held him. My daughter, who is 7 and asks questions about everything, sat in the backseat singing a song she made up about clouds. The drive out to Green Road takes about 40 minutes from our house. The land sits just past the county line, off a 2-lane road that gets quiet fast once you're past the feed store. My mother used to grow orchids in that greenhouse. After she died, my father closed it up and never went back in. At least that's what I thought. I pulled into the gravel lot and my daughter pressed her face against the window. It's like a jungle, she said. She wasn't wrong. The outside of the greenhouse was almost completely overtaken. Vines along the glass panels. Weeds pushing through the gravel. The small equipment shed to the side had lost 2 boards off its face. The main farmhouse, which my father had used as a storage building for the last decade, had a gutter hanging at an angle. I unbuckled my daughter and we walked to the greenhouse door together. The handle was stiff. I had to pull twice before it opened. The smell hit me first. soil and rust and something faintly sweet underneath, like the memory of flowers rather than the flowers themselves. Panels of glass ran along the ceiling, most of them intact. The wooden planting tables were still there, warped in places but standing. Old clay pots lined one wall. A rusted irrigation pipe ran the length of the structure. My daughter walked straight to a row of broken pots and began examining them like a scientist. I walked slowly down the center path. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was just walking, just being there, just trying to feel close to him for a few more minutes before the world went back to being what it was. I reached the far end of the greenhouse, where a workbench ran across the back wall. My father had built it himself when I was about 6 years old. I remembered standing on a step stool handing him nails. There was a small shelf above the bench, and on that shelf sat a row of notebooks, the kind with the black and white marbled covers, the kind my father had used for everything his whole life. Grocery lists, plant schedules, notes to himself. There were 5 of them. I picked up the first one. Plant records from 2003. The second was maintenance logs. The third was financial records from the early days of the greenhouse operation. The fourth was blank. The fifth one was different. It didn't have anything written on the outside, but when I opened it, the first page had my name on it. Not typed. Handwritten, in my father's handwriting, in the blue pen he always used. Claire, if you found this, it means you listened to me, even after I was gone. You always were the one who came back to things. My hands were shaking. My daughter was still across the greenhouse, quietly talking to herself about the pots. I sat down on the edge of the workbench and kept reading. I know the will looks like I shortchanged you. Let people think what they want. You were never the one who needed to be seen by everyone else. You just needed to be seen by the right person at the right time, and I believe this land is going to do that for you. I stopped. Read that again, then kept going. About 2 years ago, a development company reached out to me about this property. They were quiet about it, like they didn't want to start a rush. They said they were scouting land along the county corridor for a clean energy distribution project. Something about a solar collection grid and a transmission hub. This land, they said, sits directly inside the proposed boundary. They offered me an amount. I'm not going to write here because I don't want it to change how you read the rest of this. I told them no. I wasn't ready to sell. And honestly, I wasn't sure you were ready to receive it. But I've been watching you for years, and I know you now. You wait. You read before you decide. You don't tell anyone anything until you're sure. Those are the exact qualities you need to handle what this land is about to become. There's a folder in the equipment shed. Second cabinet, bottom drawer, behind the irrigation manuals. Take it home, read everything. Then call the number on the last page. Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until you've spoken to someone who can help you protect it. I love you more than 11 acres. But 11 acres might just be enough to show you what you're worth. I sat there for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. My daughter came and leaned against my leg, and I put my hand on her hair and just breathed. Outside, the county road was quiet. No cars, no noise. Just the sound of wind moving through the old glass overhead. I folded the notebook carefully and put it in my bag. Then I walked to the equipment shed. The second cabinet was there exactly where he said. The bottom drawer stuck, but I worked it open. Behind 3 years of irrigation manuals was a manila folder, thick and worn at the edges. I took it out and held it. The outside said Green Road in my father's handwriting, and under that, just, for Claire. I didn't open it there. I called my daughter over, took her hand, and we walked back to the car. She fell asleep before we hit the highway. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and my father's notebook in my bag and something entirely new moving around in my chest. That night, after my daughter was in bed and my husband was watching TV in the other room, I went to the kitchen table and opened the folder. There were letters. Some from the county planning office. Some from 2 different development companies, one from a state energy agency. They were dated across a span of about 18 months, the most recent one just 4 months ago, when my father was already sick and slowing down. I read them in order. The first few were exploratory introductions, requests for meetings, general language about regional infrastructure and corridor planning. Then they became more specific. A proposed solar transmission network running through the eastern part of the county. A collection hub requiring between 8 and 15 acres of flat, accessible land with proximity to an existing road grid. Preliminary studies had identified 3 sites. Green Road was listed as the primary site, preferred above the others because of its soil composition, road access, and distance from residential zones. I kept reading. One letter was from the county planning office, addressed to my father directly, informing him that the preliminary land use study had designated the Green Road parcel as a priority site for commercial and energy infrastructure development. It used language I had to look up: conditional rezoning approval, pending ownership transfer agreement, commercial development corridor, and then the offer letters. 2 of them. From 2 different companies, submitted about 6 months apart. I read the first number and felt lightheaded. I read the second number, which was higher, and had to put the paper down and look at the wall for a moment. The last page of the folder was a single index card in my father's handwriting. On it was a name: Robert Vance, land use attorney, and a phone number with a local area code. Under the number my father had written, "He knows. Call him first." I closed the folder and sat very still. The TV was on in the other room. I could hear my husband laughing at something. I thought about going in there. I thought about laying the folder on the coffee table and watching his face. I thought about saying, "You want to talk about an embarrassment?" I didn't. My father said, "Call the attorney first." My father's instincts had been right about everything so far. I put the folder in my tote bag, put the notebook on top of it, and went to bed. The next morning, I dropped my daughter off at school and called the number on the index card from the parking lot. Robert Vance answered on the second ring, like he'd been expecting someone. I told him my name. There was a small pause. "Claire," he said. "Your father told me you'd call eventually. I'm very sorry for your loss." He had already been briefed. My father had met with him 6 months ago and walked him through everything: the property, the offers, the development timeline, all of it. Robert confirmed that the county had officially approved the corridor project. The approval had gone through about 6 weeks ago, after my father passed. Construction on the transmission infrastructure was expected to begin within the year, and the land acquisition phase was already underway. Both companies that had submitted offers to my father were still active. "What does that mean for the property?" I asked. "It means," he said carefully, "that you are in an extraordinarily strong negotiating position." He told me not to speak to either company without him present. He told me not to discuss the property's value with anyone in my family, including my husband, until we had finalized either a sale agreement or a development partnership structure. He explained that as inherited property, the land was mine alone, not subject to marital assets under state law, which meant my husband had no legal claim to it regardless of what happened between us. That word, regardless, sat in the air for a second. I understood what he meant. I asked him to explain it plainly. He said that if I were to divorce, my husband could not touch this land or any proceeds from it because it came to me as an inheritance before any transaction occurred. I thanked him and said I would call him by the end of the week. I sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes after that. Then I put the car in drive and went home and said absolutely nothing. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went through the ordinary motions of everything: making dinner, driving my daughter to her activities, folding laundry while carrying a complete second life inside my head. I researched the development project online and found the county commission meeting notes where it had been approved. I found one of the companies listed in a news article about regional energy infrastructure investments. I read everything I could find. My husband noticed nothing. He was busy with his own work, which he talked about constantly, and busy being mildly irritated with me, which was something he did the way other people breathe without really thinking about it. One evening, he mentioned the property again. A colleague of his had done some work in that county, he said. Agricultural land out there doesn't move fast. You might be sitting on that thing for years before anyone makes you an offer, and even then it won't be anything meaningful. I said, probably. He looked at me for a second like he was waiting for more, then went back to his dinner. I called Robert Vance on Friday. We met in his office on Monday. He had already reached out, carefully and without disclosing my identity, to both development companies to confirm their continued interest in the property. Both had responded within 48 hours. We spent 2 hours going through documents, timelines, and options. He explained 2 paths: a full sale, clean and immediate, or a partial sale with a retained land interest that would earn me a percentage of the energy output revenue for up to 25 years. The second option was more complex. It was also significantly more lucrative over time. I asked him which one my father had been leaning toward. Robert smiled. He said your father spent 4 months learning everything he could about solar land lease agreements, and by the time he stopped meeting with me, he knew more about them than most clients I work with. I told him I needed 2 more weeks. He said, "Take 3. During those 3 weeks, I thought carefully about everything. I thought about my daughter, about her school, about where I wanted to be in 5 years. I thought about my marriage with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I thought about the way my husband had said embarrassment in the kitchen that night. I thought about how many times he had spoken, and I had stayed quiet, and how I had always told myself that was wisdom. I started to understand it was something else. I called a family law attorney recommended by a colleague. She was direct and thorough. She confirmed everything Robert had told me about inherited property. She also walked me through what a divorce process would look like given our assets, our daughter, our current arrangements. She didn't push me in any direction. She just made sure I understood my options. I sat with all of it. I made my decision on a Sunday afternoon, sitting outside in the yard while my daughter drew on the patio with chalk. 2 days later, I signed a letter of intent with Robert Vance, selecting the partial sale and retained interest structure with the higher of the 2 companies. The full terms would take another 6 to 8 weeks to finalize, but the letter established priority and locked in the negotiating framework. The projected value over the full agreement term had 7 digits in it. The upfront land payment alone was more than my husband had earned in the last 4 years combined. I filed for divorce the following Monday. My husband was served on a Wednesday. He called me that evening, and his voice was very different from any voice I'd heard from him before. Not angry. Something else. Something more uncertain. He said, "I don't understand what's happening." I said, "I think you do." There was a long pause. He said, "Is this about the greenhouse?" I didn't answer that. He said, "Claire, come on." I was frustrated. "Your father, I mean, I said things I shouldn't have said." "That doesn't mean." I said, "I know what it means. I've known for a long time. I just needed to be sure about everything before I did anything." He asked if we could talk in person. I said my attorney would be in touch about the process. He called 2 more times that week. Both times I let them go to voicemail. Both times he sounded more like someone doing math than someone feeling something, and I noticed that, and I let myself notice it. My brother found out about the divorce through the family text chain, because these things always travel fastest through the channels you didn't intend. He called me immediately, full of concern in the way that is actually mostly curiosity. He wanted to know what happened. I told him we had grown apart. He made sympathetic sounds. Then he asked, almost too casually, what I was planning to do with the property. I told him I was still figuring it out. He said he could put me in touch with that guy he mentioned, the one who handled agricultural sales. Probably move it quietly, no hassle. I said thank you, I'll keep that in mind. After we hung up, I sat with the fact that he had shifted from condolences to land management in under 4 minutes, and I thought about my father, and I thought about how well he had known both of us. 6 weeks after I filed, Robert called to tell me we were ready to move to final terms. The company's legal team had reviewed everything, the county approvals were confirmed, and the land use designation had been formally updated in the county assessor's records. He said the meeting to execute the final agreement was set for the following Thursday. I asked my mother's oldest friend, a woman who had known me since I was born, to watch my daughter that day. I didn't tell her what it was for. I said I had a business meeting. She asked if everything was okay. I said it was better than okay. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully, drove to Robert's office, sat across from two people from the development company's acquisitions team and a third from their legal department, and signed a 60-page agreement. Robert sat beside me the entire time. He had reviewed every line. He pointed out 3 places where language had been softened from the original terms, and the company's team agreed to restore them. At the end, the lead acquisitions person extended her hand and said, "Your father was a smart man." I shook her hand and said, "Yes, he really was." I drove home alone. I took the long way, past the county road, past the feed store, down to the gravel lot at Green Road. I pulled in and sat with the engine off, looking at the greenhouse. They would take it down eventually, once the construction phase began. The glass panels, the old workbench, the shelf where my father had left me a notebook with my name on it. It would all be cleared. But it had done everything it needed to do. I thought about that night in the kitchen when my husband said embarrassment. I thought about my brother at the will reading, nodding once with his theory confirmed. I thought about Mrs. Aldridge reading calmly from her document, and how the room had shifted, and how I had watched everyone's faces rearrange themselves. I thought about my father, already sick, still corresponding with development companies and land use attorneys and county planning offices, refusing every offer, building something carefully, leaving a notebook where only someone who came back to things would find it. He wasn't here to see any of this. That was the part that sat heaviest. There was no version of this story where he got to see his plan work. He had trusted it to me completely, without knowing for certain that I would even go to the greenhouse. Without knowing that I would find the notebook, without knowing that I would be patient enough to do it the right way. But he knew me, and I thought that had to mean something. I got out of the car and walked to the greenhouse door one more time. I pulled it open. The smell of soil and rust was still there. The light through the old glass panels fell the same way it always had. My daughter wasn't with me this time. It was just me and the empty planting tables and the sound of wind through the vents. I walked to the back bench. The shelf was empty. I had taken the notebooks home weeks ago, kept them in a box in my closet. But I stood there anyway, in the place where he had left something for me to find, and I said thank you quietly to a room that held nothing but memory. Then I walked back out, got in my car, and went to pick up my daughter from school. She came running out the door with a drawing she had made in art class. It was a house with a sun behind it. She said it was for our new place, wherever we were going to live next. I said it was beautiful. She said she made the sun extra big because suns are actually really powerful, even when they're far away. I buckled her in and told her she was right about that. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later. My husband had retained counsel to review the asset situation when he eventually found out, and he did find out, through the county public records, which are public for exactly this reason, but there was nothing to contest. The land was inherited. The agreement had been signed before any division proceedings. Robert had structured everything with exactly this possibility in mind because he had sat with my father long enough to understand what kind of people might be in the room when all of this finally surfaced. My husband called one more time after the finalization. He wasn't angry. He mostly sounded like someone standing outside a door they had once walked through casually, only to discover it had been locked the entire time and the lock had always been there, they had just never tried it. He said, "You knew the whole time." I said, "I knew from the day I went to the greenhouse." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You told me it was an embarrassment. I believed you deserved to find out from the county records." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father really did a number on me." I thought about that for a second. I said, "My father gave his daughter what she needed. That's all he did." I didn't wait for a response. I said goodbye and ended the call. My brother and I have a relationship now that is careful and polite, like furniture in a room that everyone walks around without saying why. He has never asked me directly about the terms of the agreement. I have never offered. There are things in families that stay in the air, unspoken, and this is one of them. He got what he got, I got what I got. Our father knew both of us well enough to understand the difference. My daughter and I moved into a house on the other side of the county in the fall. It has a yard with 2 old maple trees and a porch that catches the afternoon light. She has her own room with a window seat that she has already filled with stuffed animals and library books. I drove past the Green Road property about 3 months after construction started. The greenhouse was gone. The shed was gone. In their place were the early forms of something large and ordered graded land, equipment, the beginning shapes of infrastructure. The county road that used to feel like it went nowhere now had temporary construction signage along both shoulders. I pulled over and looked for a minute. Somewhere under all of that was the soil where my mother grew orchids and my father recorded everything in notebooks with black and white marbled covers. Somewhere in there was the floor where I had once stood on a step stool handing nails to a man who already knew, even then, that the most important things are rarely the things that look most impressive. He gave me 11 acres of weeds, my husband had said. He gave me everything, I thought. He just waited until he was sure I was ready for it. I put the car in drive and went home to my daughter.